This is Regenerative Skills, the podcast helping you to learn the skills and solutions to create an abundant and connected future. I'm your host, Oliver Gaucher. So at this point, I think we all know that YouTube videos, social media posts, and blog snippets will only get you so far. If you really want to develop the knowledge and skills you need to live regeneratively, you need the thorough information in a full book. Through their diverse range of publications, New Society Publishers' books explore topics that are at the forefront of creating positive change in our world. From regenerative agriculture and permaculture to social justice and eco-conscious living, their books cover a wide spectrum of subjects that empower readers to lead more regenerative and fulfilling lives. So whether you're a seasoned environmentalist, a curious beginner, or someone simply seeking inspiration and guidance on your journey towards regenerative living, New Society Publishers is here to support you every step of the way. If you subscribe right now to their newsletter at newsociety.com, you'll be the first to receive sneak peeks at new content and get discounts on upcoming title releases. You'll even get an exclusive discount code on their first purchase of books, ebooks, or audiobooks. So sign up today at newsociety.com. Hey there everybody, and welcome to another panel session. Now I love this format in general, but this panel in particular was a whole lot of fun because not only did I have my close friends Nick Steiner and Neary on, but I also joined as a speaker to explore the topic of water management for farmers in a changing climate. Now the guiding question that we explored was, how can farmers prepare for a changing climate and ensure long-term water resilience? We explored water retention, flood management, and drought resilience, breaking down strategies that help farms thrive despite increasing climate uncertainty. And we started by talking about the key changes that farmers should expect in the coming decades and how to assess hydrological health on your farm to start with. From there, we went into practical steps to build a holistic water management strategy and how to navigate the many options available for water retention. Now, if you've been listening for any amount of time to this show, you'll know me and my friend Nick as we work together closely and have talked about water cycle restoration and our contracting jobs in creating water retention landscapes in many past episodes. Now, our good friend Neary is new to this show. She works with Elemental Ecosystems and the Water Stories team as a project technician. With a background in geology and conservation, Megan specializes in reshaping landscapes to improve soil health, enhance biodiversity, and create decentralized water systems. Now, there's a whole Q&A session that I chopped from this podcast version just for brevity, but if you're interested, you can find it at the Climate Farmers YouTube channel. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this panel discussion. Welcome, everybody, to this panel focused on water management for farmers in the changing climate conditions that we are facing these days. I'm Oliver Gaucher. I work with the community side of Climate Farmers, where we help to assist farmers in connecting with and learning from peers of other people who are aspiring to regenerative management in their farms around Europe. I specifically work on assisting the transition journey, and that's entirely the intention of this series of panels as we explore the different challenges and the topics of interest that primarily come up through the community chats and what people are working with on a day-to-day basis. And given that water is such a constant issue for farmers, whether it's too much, too little, or at the wrong times, we're going to explore today all of the different options that are out there and some of the process in evaluating these options and how they might work out for your farm. So to get us started, I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves today. So starting with Megan, can you give us a short introduction on you and your work?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, guys. My name is Neary. I'm coming from Whitefish, Montana today. And I am currently working with Water Stories and Elemental Ecosystems, and we install water cycle restoration projects all across the world. And we do all sorts of things, working with excavator, reshaping the land so that we slow down the rainwater, allow it to infiltrate and recharge aquifers. My company is called Resilient Earth Solutions. And yeah, I have a lot to say, and I'm super excited to be here with you guys today. So Nick, take it off.
Yeah, I'm Nick Steiner, and originally I got into water, I think 12, 13 years ago, together with my good friend Philip, who's also here in the call, which is amazing. So we were organizing events to fundraise for water development projects. And ever since that point, water has been my passion, and I wanted to dive much deeper into it and get more to the root of how we can really restore water cycles. And around 8 years ago, I moved to Tenerife in the Canary Islands. And here, for the first time, I realized it doesn't rain everywhere, and it's not normal to have unlimited water. And so I really started a passion for getting every drop harvested, so to say, and getting water into the ground. And that was a very long journey. And then I rejoined Philip in 2020 with Climate Farmers. And there I was responsible for building up the educational side. Did that for a while, but then my water passion just didn't stop. And so I had to go full on into that a few years later. And now working there also on projects focused in Europe, but also all around the world. And also joined Zach and Megan at Water Stories. So also doing a lot of education now around water cycle restoration and just getting the word out there, since, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in the water space. Yeah, but our fantastic host, Oliver, probably has some great stories for us and will guide us through the discussion.
Well, so look, before we get started, I know that I'm normally the one who guides these panels, and I will be doing that, but I'm also going to be contributing a bit from my side of my experience. So in working with farmers in the community, I've also helped to coach quite a number of our community through the process of creating holistic water management strategies for their farm. And I also work in consulting and installation of these systems, similar to both Nick and Megan, both of whom I have learned a ton from in working with them over the last couple of years. And water has been a challenge in all the different places that I've worked. And this is why it's something that I continue to bring into the narrative of transition to regenerative management for farmers. In Guatemala, we had a very severe separation between the wet and the dry season, and trying to stretch out the access to moisture really determined what was possible for a lot of our farmers. Here in Spain, we are constantly dealing with drought and flood cycles as the effects of, let's say, land management caused climate change continues to exacerbate around here. But to get this conversation off, let's set that as the foundation for what we're talking about. Megan, can you tell us about the patterns that you have seen from working all around the world that are setting the challenges that so many land managers face right now?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the patterns are actually quite similar globally. And what we're seeing is that there is not necessarily a decrease in the annual precipitation, but what there is a decrease in the consistency of annual precipitation. So what I mean by that is that when the storms do finally come, they come hard. They come with lots and lots of rain all at once, or lots and lots of snow all at once. And that causes flood. The soil at that point is caked into a hard concrete mat, so it can't infiltrate, and then exacerbates the drought even further. And then in between those really huge deluges, you have these periods of dry where you get nothing, no rain. Temperatures are also climbing in most places on average, getting a little hotter, which means that the plants that have adapted to that area, also in conjunction with land use changes, now can't really survive. So what I've seen over in the coast of Oregon, where we work quite frequently, is a couple of summers ago, it got so hot that the tops of the spruce trees on the coast started to die. That's how hot it was. That the conifer forest now is like, whoa, I don't know if this cell climate thing is for me. Like now, maybe juniper is going to be a more appropriate species there. So yeah, those are just a few patterns I've seen, again, primarily based in the US, but we've done a lot of work in Europe, a bit in South America, and then a little bit in Africa as well. And it's sort of the same story in all of those places. But I'm curious, Nick, what have you seen?
Yeah, it goes in a very similar direction. So also it's the spreading out of the rain events. So like heavy rain event, long drought, heavy rain event. And what is a very common theme among the farmers that we work with and the landscapes we have there are these massive erosion channels. So sometimes you can see them quite small. You just see a bit of a head cut and some water that has been cutting there. But I've visited many farms now where the erosion cuts are 4 or 5 meters or more, and you can really stand into them and you see the walls on both sides going up. And on one side, it's kind of shocking, especially when we visit them in like July, August, and everything is really baked and dry. on the other side, these cuts also give me a lot of hope because they do show that the water is there, and it's just a question of kind of storing it and making it available throughout the year and turning it from something that's just cutting and destroying the landscape into something that can be positive. So I think the main thing for me is really this, like, okay, how many years do we still have where rain patterns are somewhat regular? And so that's kind of the motivations, like, hey, let's work on this now. And especially for us here on Tenerife, we kind of have a time machine because here things are so much worse than in other places rain-wise. So normally we have an average of 280 millimeters of rain every year. I think that's around 11 inches for those in the US. And last year we only had 80 millimeters over 12 months. And that's really tough. And so here we only live with rainwater, and if it doesn't rain, we can't do anything. And my neighbors are also farming on a very small scale, and they've seeded 3 times to get a harvest in for their animals. So they're mainly seeding different mixes of animal fodder, and it never rained enough. So the whole year, the whole field was just brown. And there it's really shocking to see, like, okay, now they had to go to feeding their cattle cactus leaves. And so they're just taking the thorns off, and that's the food that's available. And that gives us an insight into, okay, what might we have to deal with in other places. But it's also great motivation to see, like, okay, look, let's find solutions that work here, and then in places that still get much more rain, what will be working there. But here we're almost in Africa, geographically speaking. It's much wetter still on the Iberian Peninsula, specifically where you are, Oliver. So how's that in your region? You still get much more rain, no?
Yeah, we do. In fact, the last year we were significantly above our average annual rainfall. This area historically has been around 750 millimeters, and we got about 900 by the end of the year. But that's coming on the tail end of 3 years of quite significant drought. The year prior had been only 400 millimeters. And this area is specifically famous in Spain when they talk about drought, because I'm about 15 minutes south of the Sal Reservoir, which is famous because it's got a church steeple sticking up from the town that was sunk when they installed the thing. And they use that almost as like a barometer for where the water levels and the access and the scarcity is. And for the first time in the history since that was installed, not only could you see the entire steeple of the church, you could see the foundation of the church and almost an entire church depth again lower. It got down to 4% of its capacity. And this was not unusual for other reservoirs around the peninsula. Now, this is a big enough landmass that rain patterns do not affect the entire peninsula the same way. There were other areas that had significant rainfall during that time. And so to build on the patterns globally that you both mentioned, which is absolutely, I don't have much to expand on that. I can maybe offer an insight because I've been doing a lot of research into how those patterns are looking like at a local level. In fact, I just got back from a conference that talked about this area of Las Guillerías, which is a natural park here in central Catalonia, and how the last 30 years of patterns have changed from the historical averages before that. So we've lost about 35% of the average rainfall in the last 30 years. So we're moving towards a further southern and western climate. So we have reference within driving distance as to the climate that is coming our way. And based on the projections of where that's going, that could be a short drive, or it could be a long southwestern drive, which would really change the dynamic of the biological the biological communities that are around here. Yeah. And at the same time, as we have been getting much, much drier winters, we've been getting massive storms in the summer, which are actually above average for this area. The difference in just the amount of rain, though, is not reflected in these numbers because these storms not only are happening really fast and sudden, like those patterns you mentioned, but they've been coming increasingly with hail, which can absolutely decimate a crop. So great, you've got this moisture, but you also don't have any intact leaves anymore. So what good does it do you? You've just been set back an entire season, right? And I think these extreme events are becoming not only more common, but erratic and are happening outside of the seasons when you might be able to predictably protect against them. And one last thing I want to add on to the patterns here is that it's not just about what's happening in the weather and the climate, but as a response to this, many, especially industrially motivated and large-scale farms, are over-extracting groundwater in order to compensate for the erratic rainfall patterns that they're seeing. And so where once you might be able to reliably dig a fairly shallow well or a borehole, of which there are more than 1 million illegal ones around Spain alone, in order to compensate for erratic access to water. Now, the water table has dropped so significantly that you can't access that anymore, or certainly not reliably, and wells are going dry. And this is being paired increasingly with restrictions on access for irrigation for farmers who used to rely on that for their yield. So that hopefully paints a picture of the challenges that we're starting to face. And let's go from there now to exploring the process of analyzing what options are available in confronting these challenges. Megan, what have you been seeing? Because this is really what you help your clients all around the world to evaluate. What are some of the things that bring hope under these conditions?
Yeah, definitely. And I have a little bit more to add on to in terms of patterns, in terms of time frame and perspective. So I think it's always an interesting conversation to speak about climate change from a human perspective, because I think we have such short memories, especially today. So my background is in geology and geophysics, and I, am used to thinking in terms of millennia. And so when you look back through the geological record, you see that the climate, there was one thing that's for sure, and it's always been changing. Now, I'm not getting into any arguments of what, who, when, where is causing it, but I'm just saying that it's a fact that climate's constantly changing. And what gives me a lot of hope is looking at ancient peoples in different places. So there was one of our community members who recently posted his reflections on a trip to Peru and the Inca and what they did with the terracing at 12,000 feet above sea level, and how they grew crops there year round and fed like thousands of people. And so I think, not to say we should go backwards, but we should look at the ancient knowledge that we have in these different places, especially the Iberian Peninsula. People have been living there for really a long thousands of years, and looking at the old water harvesting methods that they used to use, because in the end, it's quite simple, really. And it's a matter of perspective. And if we look at rain as a gift and treat it as such, really amazing things can happen. And that's what a lot of these ancient civilizations have figured out. It's how do we use the most low-tech technology to work with the landscape, with the rains, with the flooding, so that we can get infiltration, get more water availability throughout the year, because it's really quite a feedback cycle. And that's something that I don't even like that word capture. We're not capturing it. We're encouraging it to infiltrate. And so if you encourage water to infiltrate and really use that gift that's coming from the sky, it increases the amount of vegetation that you can grow. And then with that increase in vegetation, you get more evapotranspiration that happens. With that evapotranspiration, you get a cooling effect. And then that creates more moisture, because then the rain, you provide more nuclei for the water to condensate onto, causing rain, which is more water. So you can grow more plants. And it's just this wonderful loop. And before I get too far into that tangent, Nick, do you have anything to share in regards to things that you've seen?
Yeah, I think to just build on what you just said about the ancient ways, I think we kind of forgot to work with gravity a lot. And it's such a pity, where it's like gravity can do so much work for us. So we really don't need a lot of elevation change to bring water from A to B. And it's really just, with gravity, if we have one spot that's only just a few millimeters lower than another, water is going to go to that spot. And so with that, we can do so much to bring water to the places where we want it, and to kind of keep it out of the places where we don't want it. And if we combine that with different techniques of infiltration, I think that's really the goal, and kind of recharging our bank account. That's our aquifer below the ground. So we really need to focus much more on the recharge of that. And it's also where I'm seeing a big difference when you have these like plowed fields, really compacted areas, and there, as soon as it rains, you just see this like muddy slurry running off, taking all the topsoil with it. And then you have these other areas that are well managed, that have vegetation cover, and there when it rains, they can handle it, they can infiltrate it. And that also gives me a lot of hope in that regard. And saying, no matter where you go, there's examples of like, hey, look, if this is managed in this way, there's a way of doing it. And there's also solutions for different types of agriculture. And for me, like a few years ago, I was just really keen on just earthworks, because it's just so much fun to work with excavators and all that. But also now the more I'm learning about also different styles of farm in that regard, and just what can be done with animals is absolutely incredible. And so what you see there with animal impact and how much water that can infiltrate, you might not need an excavator ever to do anything, if you have an animal herd that can do the work for us. And so on the hope side, the cool thing is like in every climate, in every situation, for every type of agriculture, there are solutions that we can apply and that have worked for thousands of years. And it's just we need to kind of remember how it worked before we had really cheap pumps and tubes and just diesel to run big machines. And I mean, you've looked a lot also into kind of older technologies and these kind of things, Oliver. So how's that from your side? You also thinking of going back or excited about new technology that's coming out water-wise? How's your perspective?
Well, you know me, man. I'm always going backwards. I have no ambition to integrate technology into anything. No, I'm just kidding. But we are really entering into a nerd subject here, especially if you get into the traditional water management of dryland ecologies. So many incredible innovations have come out thousands of years ago from places like Iran and the Middle East and the deserts of South America and such. They have the Quanat system here in the Iberian Peninsula as well, which came from Iran and more locally is called minas or mines. But it's a way of basically creating horizontal wells through a series of perforations in the soil where you can access them from there, but it's a way of allowing them to aerate so that they don't get plugged up or have a negative pressure and they flow sideways, often from either groundwater sources or springs higher up in the landscape, usually at the mid-range of mountains and such, and are distributed through the more cultivatable lands down below. There's the acequias, which is more common to see down in the south, where they're the traditional irrigation channels. And I might be getting the details of it wrong, but I think the oldest democratic governance in anywhere in Spain is actually the organization that governs the distribution of these waterways and these gravity-fed irrigation channels in the Valencia region. So this is not new stuff. And the technology and the ideas that came up, I think it was mostly through the Islamic occupation and the caliphate in the beginning of the Middle Ages, helped to create an incredible capacity for irrigated agriculture that just wasn't here before. Now, there's so many other things that have happened since then, the aqueducts that the Romans built, and there's no reason why these should be incompatible with the incredible technology we have access to now, which can be supplemented onto these. But I tell you which one of them is still going to be standing and working when fuel prices go too high or when the electricity gets cut out, So I think there needs to be a marriage of the two rather than right now what we have is an over-reliance on technology, which often allows us to deplete sources of water that otherwise were inaccessible and quite frankly, maybe shouldn't have been touched. And if we constantly are drawing down from this bank account of stored water, we are not going to have it when real emergencies come. And well, we can talk about whether or not we're in a real emergency right now, but actually, so Water Stories is one of the organizations that has proposed an incredible idea of making free access to surface water and making it much harder to access groundwater, because that really is the reserve that we have in case there is no more surface water. How do you think about this, Megan? I mean, you've seen so many different examples from around the world and the technologies that either complement this or actively erode it. Where do you see the marriage between these options?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that. So first, in regards to technology, I have a lot of faith and I'm very excited with the new technologies. And I 100% think that we should be using everything in our arsenal and applying it to these challenges, but applying it with the correct mindset, right? Applying it with creating resiliency for the future generations, not just, your fiscal quarter necessarily. And so I would say that, I mean, that's sort of our whole not mission, but like a lot of projects we install, we use modern technology to achieve that. Now, there's been several projects we've done completely by hand, and that's an incredible opportunity as well. But I would say that, just like how quickly a machine can degrade the landscape, that same amount of speed, you can use the technology with the right mindset and being able to read the landscape correctly to achieve incredible results. And so, yeah, I have a lot of faith. And I think the integration of sort of the past ancient systems, more gravity based, low tech, married with our new technology, that's the solution forward for sure. Because in the end, we're farmers. We need to make a profit, right? So we still need to merge the idyllic, sustainable landscape with the reality of my kids need to go to school, And then in regards to, so this is the tricky part, and it's very nuanced when it comes to pumping groundwater versus farmers who just use rainwater, right? The rainwater, we've already talked about a lot of that. The challenges there, but groundwater is a little bit more interesting because it changes very much. So for example, there's a lot of aquifers that are really ancient. So when we speak about groundwater recharge, now we're not saying that tomorrow you'll have water in your bank account deep down below. No, not necessarily. There's a lot of aquifers, especially where I grew up and where I live now, that were in place 10,000, 100,000 years ago. And they're very deep in the ground and require electricity to pump out. And even if we create as much water retention on the surface as possible, we may not see that return in our lifetime. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be installing these features. It's just to say, again, it's that mindset of, I want my grandchildren 7 generations from now to have access to the resources I have access to today. And I would say, be curious, learn your watershed, understand where the water in your aquifer is coming from. And there's some places where aquifer recharge is actually quite quick, like within 100 years or so. And so if you're in one of those places, you should be doing this work yesterday. Like let's get that water in the ground as soon as possible. But yeah, okay. Over to you, Nick. What do you got for us?
Yeah, I think what I was just thinking about is a lot of the kind of the approach that we take. And what really changed for me is a lot is in observation and learning about kind of the goals of the landscape in the context of the land, where you have it especially in kind of the permaculture bubble, where you look at any kind of landscape and it's just like, okay, how many swales can we pump onto that land? And then you just have a landscape that's just covered in random swales that don't make any sense and make management more or less impossible. And so if you purely look at water infiltrated, it's a very simple solution. It stopped it from going down the hill and it infiltrates it into the ground. But if that doesn't fit the landscape, you just create this weird, unmanageable landscape. And especially here in the context of farms, I think it's so important to really look at, okay, what type of farm is it? How is it managed? What are the goals? And also water-wise, like what is that water needed for? And that informs so much also of how we would approach kind of the landscape reading and what we want to do with the land. Where then when we're on the land and we're reading it, we can see, okay, if it's for example, like the smallest type, so market garden, there's a high need for water to irrigate and to just have water available in some form of storage that can be used in an irrigation system. Then when you have animal systems where you need, a lot of livestock, they're thirsty, especially in summer. So also there to have enough water available, that's important to have that. Whereas when you have a system where it's more kind of leaning towards perennial systems, agroforestry systems and all that, you might not need that much water that's kind of stored in tanks or lakes or all that. But if that water is just in the ground and the roots can get to it, even a few meters down, then that informs a completely different design. And I think that is so important also in our approach of reading the landscape when we know, okay, these are the kind of goals that we want to achieve and what approaches make sense. And there also on the reading side, I really love looking at plants there. And even though I've been doing it for quite some years now, I'm still learning so much, and I still feel like I know nothing when really reading the plants. And it's so beautiful. That's also what we had during Water Stories workshop in Italy. And Lorenzo was there, Lorenzo Costa, and we also walked the land with him and with Zach Weiss. And it's just so nice. It's like to see. It's like, it's this type of plant growing there and this type of plant growing there. So yeah, pretty sure if we start digging here, we're going to see seepage underground. Start digging and boop, there's water underground where it looked super dry. And so I'm applying more and more of that. Also, when I'm looking at dry landscape where we had it, one example also in Spain, we were working on a farm and it looked super dry and it seemed like there's not that much hope, but there were some rushes growing in some spots. And so these rushes, they would require water that's not too deep down. And so in that spot, we started digging, and there was seepage just less than a meter under the surface. And it's like, actually the water is there, we just don't see it. And I think that is also so important for all landowners to not just look at topographic maps, to not just look at the landscape from a tractor or from a four-wheel drive, but actually just walking the land in all different kinds of situations and looking at the patterns of plants and looking what's there. And I think if everyone can spend much more time on pattern recognition and kind of looking at what's there, we can make much better decisions, because everyone can put a pump, drill a hole, and then irrigate that way. But the water is there. We just have to kind of find and use it in a better way. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's a journey that will be a lifelong one to improve the land reading skills, but it's just fascinating to do it that way. Yeah, how have you improved your land reading skills in that regard, Oliver?
Man, I completely agree with you. It's absolutely a lifelong pursuit, and the idea of being a landscape detective is extremely attractive to me, especially my inner child is like just going around finding clues, seeing what it tells you, checking to see if it's right, seeing them evolve and change over different seasons and different conditions over time. It's a living puzzle, and it's always new everywhere you go. And as I continue to go through seasons here on my own farm, watching how the landscape responds to different, like you're pulling this string, you're adding this thing, you're chopping this to see how it's endlessly fascinating. But I'm really glad how you brought us into the necessary consideration of unique context in everything that we're doing here. We talked about how similar the patterns are worldwide, and they may be being experienced in different ways on your particular plot of land, but there always needs to be deep contextual consideration when you're evaluating the options that you're looking at. I can give some very simple examples, which might be a little bit oversimplified and perhaps a little reductionist, because there's always exceptions to anything that I would mention. But if you're in an area that tends towards a more arid climate, where evaporation is far exceeding your average annual rainfall or your accessibility of moisture, you might want to consider not having a whole bunch of surface water bodies. You're going to lose most of that water to evaporation really fast. In those cases, infiltration and storing it underground is far more effective. If you're in an area that gets an excess of rainfall quite regularly, usually I give a lot of options before looking at drainage, but that has traditionally been the way that people have managed an excess of moisture. Quite frankly, I think there are far better options for managing semi-aquatic landscapes, wetlands, temporal streams, and things like that. In fact, if you're a farmer, we could have a whole conversation just about the incredible specialty and difficult to find or access plants that have incredible market value, even if you're not doing them on scale, to say nothing about the biodiversity and the ability to manage everything from disease to pest outbreaks when you have a concentration of, let's say, pest control species, whether that's birds or amphibians or all of these other things that are incredibly rare these days because so many semi-aquatic landscapes have been drained. So there's options for all of these extremes, but you have to know your context in order to be able to evaluate those options, right? Like you mentioned earlier, Nick, knowing the requirements of your farm enterprise, knowing when you need water, the frequency, the amount is going to determine how you start to design for infiltration or retention or distribution based on the requirements of your enterprises. In all cases, I would recommend people start to look at polycultures that can help to regulate these things in multiple different ways, because even if you have the most redundant and robust system, there's always going to be points of failure or difficulties of access under the extremes we're starting to see. And so if you have a diversity of plantings and different types of ecosystems on your farm, the year in which there's severe scarcity might be terrible for your annuals, but perhaps some of your diverse perennial or tree plantings might be able to get through and still give you a yield, so it's not a total loss. Or maybe you get a whole bunch of rain, and similarly, some of the weaker things that are sensitive to that might develop mold problems or pest problems that they wouldn't in other years. But with the diversity of other things, you might still be able to maintain a yield and get through the season. And so really diversity, not only in enterprises, but in crops and in water management features on your site, obviously contextually paired, are the general pattern of recommendation that I always find myself advocating for, because nothing is guaranteed. These fluctuations and variables are going to happen, and you need a plan B, C, D, and so on, in hopes of making sure that nothing becomes a total loss. And this is part of the reason why we move out of monocultures. And the other reason is because they're ugly and they destroy things. And it's much more fun to have a diverse and thriving and dynamic ecosystem. Megan, what are some of the considerations and the analysis that you're always sure to do when you go onto a new site in order to properly evaluate the options you're looking at?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. Love a lot of what you just said and appreciate that. So the first thing when you're on a landscape is, first thing is you figure out what the client's goals are, right? Okay. So you have the human piece, you understand who's living on that landscape and what their goals are. Fantastic. Then you need to shut off your monkey mind. And what that means is you need to not make conclusions. You need to not go around the landscape thinking, this is where the pond will be, and this is where the row cropping will be. And you need to just listen. And then once you have your monkey mind off, you have your client goals in the back of your head, then you can walk around a landscape with an open mind and you can listen to what it has to tell you. And I know that sounds a little hippity dippity, but I'm honestly, like, every farmer 100 years ago had this down. This is how they knew when to harvest and when to not harvest, or when the rains are coming or not, or when to get their tractor out of the wet spot down in the field. And it's because they're so in tune and they have a conversation with that landscape. And so first thing you do when you're walking around is just listen. And you go around all the property boundary. Then you go to any spots that maybe call to you, like your intuition says, go left, go into this blackberry poison oak bush and see what's there. And you might just find a vernal pool with a little spring coming out. And so in that walking around the landscape, you have an open and a curious mind. And then I would even recommend sitting just for some time, however much time you have available, and observing. And a lot of times things will come to you like, maybe I should grow a different crop here. Maybe this isn't the right crop I should be growing based on what my landscape is showing me, seeing that it gets inundated every spring. And yeah, I could talk for a really long time about this, but before I jump too far into it, I'm curious what you see, Nick, and what you do when you first get onto a landscape and you're trying to take in all that information.
Wait, Megan, real quick before we pass to Nick, because you have such a wealth of knowledge in understanding the geology below ground, can you talk about some of the things that one can look for that the different minerals and the different strata underground can tell you and give you insight on?
Yeah, for sure. Where to start? So our planet is absolutely incredible. I'm obsessed with what's under our feet. And the incredible thing is everywhere around the world, it's unique. And so a piece of granite here in Montana compared to a piece of granite in Idaho has slightly different mineral combinations. And what that means is that the soil that parent material is producing is a little different and maybe has a bit more zinc or a bit less magnesium or a bit more calcium. And so you can get real deep and real nerdy about mineral availability and all of that. But when you're going around a landscape and oh my God, the most important thing, okay, not having the monkey mind, but also dig holes. Oh my God, so many people have never dug a hole on their farm. So dig a hole as deep as you can with whatever you have. If it's a shovel, go as far as you can, make it fun. We've had clients who went out with their kids for a week straight, just digging holes all around their property and came over and like, oh, wow, looks like you do have clay. It's not just sand here. Look at that, about 3 feet down. And so, yeah, I would say dig holes. And I mean, don't make your property Swiss cheese. By God, you don't need to do that. But, again, with that curious mindset, you see that, oh, this spot of your land maybe stays a little more wet in the spring. Maybe that means there's a bit of clay there. So then dig a hole, see what kind of material you have. And it's a mix between, you don't have to be an expert in geology to say this soil is sticky, right? Or this soil breaks apart in my hand. So I would say just try and approach the material underground and if you're thinking of maybe making a cornfield there, dig a hole, make notes about the texture of the material, color, the smell, stuff like that. And then start looking into conclusions as to what that material might be, if it's clay rich, if it's not, if there's lots of organic materials. And that can tell you a lot about the water availability how do I say? There's a lot of things to look at. So one is the infiltration rate of that soil, right? So if it's a sandy soil, it infiltrates very quickly. Silty soil also infiltrates pretty quickly, but also has a tendency to get inundated. Whereas clay, she's very sensitive, clay soil. But also my favorite, I mean, if I'm looking for property, I want clay soil. But it's also the most easy soil to abuse. And so with clay, if you have some abused clay soils, you know that, okay, step one, I need to introduce tons and tons of organic material to break up that soil and allow for infiltration, right? Because that's the goal, is whatever soil we have, we want the water that comes from the sky to go into the ground as fast as it can. That should be everybody's goal. And so then the question becomes, okay, what kind of material, what kind of soil do I have right now? What state is it in? Is it really healthy? Is it rich? Does it have lots of organic material? Does it have lots of fungi, bacteria, diversity? Or is it degraded? Is it compact? And how does that change throughout the seasons? And then once you have that data, you can figure out, okay, how do I get to my goal of allowing water to infiltrate as fast as possible into the ground? Does that answer your question, Olive?
Oh man, we could do a whole panel just on all of the geological insights that you've given us through water stories and through conversations that we had. It was such a pleasure to have you visit the farm here and give us insights on the different, layers of geology that we have and what we might be able to do with it. But Nick, give us some of your insights as well on the evaluation, the assessment criteria that help people to make the decisions that are correct for their context.
Yeah, since I've learned so much also from Megan and Zach and from that approach, so there's tons and tons of overlap. I'm definitely, very far from Megan's skills when it comes to reading the geology. And I was completely mind blown when we were in Italy and Zach and Megan were just going through the layers when we were doing the test slice and the granularity with which, with a little bit of a touch, how Megan can see like, oh yeah, this is this type of rock that sedimented in this way, and then this happened, and then this happened, and that's why it's now here, and like it had this much oxygen, and that was just incredible. So I definitely don't go in that much detail yet, still a long learning journey ahead. I think maybe one difference where also because before we spoke a bit about technology and that we really need to get back to old school, what I like to do is do a little bit of analysis upfront of the landform that we have. So I like to analyze a little bit the topographic data to get an idea kind of in the larger water catchment, where are we positioned? So sometimes when it's a smaller farm, like it's really clear where we are in that water catchment. One of the farms we're working with in Cadiz with Manuel, there it's 500 hectares. So, you have different catchments and all that. So it's not that simple. But I really like to have a look at the topography before visiting to just get an idea. It's like, okay, are we more towards the top, the bottom? Do we maybe have a river flowing through it? How big are the potential catchments? Because that can give us a lot of an idea of when we're then walking the land and then it's absolutely just, using our senses, getting an idea what's there. And it also depends a little bit on the time of year. So when we're working on the Iberian Peninsula, I really like going in summer when it's dry, because there you can really see, like, if everything is dry and you still have these green spots, like that's such a massive kind of, not red sign, such a massive green sign. It's like, hey, there's water here. We could do something in this area. So that always gives me a lot of hope and indication there. But also when we're going kind of in the wetter season of the year, more in winter, you can often see water pooling in areas. And that can also give us a great indication of like, hey, okay, it didn't infiltrate here. Is that something that is an opportunity for us to, do a little bit of modification and store more of it? Or is it damaging what the farmer wants to do in that location? And so there it really depends completely on the goals of the farmer, where it's kind of the two sides. It's like, okay, what does the landscape tell us and what does the landscape want? And then on the other side, what does the landowner, or in this case, the farmer want? And do these two match? Because sometimes you see just a zoning where an area that is just always flooding and they're trying to do something there, but it just doesn't make any sense because that area is always wet. And it's like, hey, if we switch that to another zone, life could be much easier when we try not to fight water. And so that is a big one. And then also in the analysis that we're doing up front, it can also give us a lot of ideas about like, okay, how much inclination do we have? So how much slope is there? Can we work with that? Or is it too much to work with? And then if we combine that with our analysis of having an idea of the size of the catchment, so if we have a massive catchment and we see large erosion channels, then it's like, okay, massive catchment, lots of water, big erosion channel. But we could also have a very small catchment and then still a massive erosion channel. And then we could see like, hey, why is that? Is that maybe that the soil likes to run away a bit more than other types? So do we maybe have some dispersive clays there that just get lost? And so we need to be really careful. So that's another big sign that I'm looking for there. But it's really just getting an idea, like what is wanted, what are the goals, what does the landscape allow us, and what can we do? And one thing that I found to be really useful, I think first time, Oliver, you used the word in analysis, the triage of doing that, where we're looking at a landscape where basically similar to what you would do in a hospital is kind of looking at, okay, if we don't do anything, will the patient potentially die? And so the patient in this case is the landscape. So if we don't fix this, and it's often the case with erosion, like if we don't do anything, will the erosion likely get worse and destroy the landscape even more? Then we have the areas where it's like, okay, if we don't do something, it will gradually get worse. And then we have the areas, it's like, okay, we could do something, but we don't really need to. And that gives us a bit of an idea of how we could approach then also the next steps. And another big one that we haven't touched on yet is just roads. So I really like looking at roads on farms when we're doing the assessment. And many times on farms, you have the kind of the paved roads, but you also have a lot of dirt roads that kind of just were created over time because people were just driving there. And they are often a great opportunity to get things correct, because I've seen on every farm there are roads that are too steep and cause a lot of erosion. And then you have roads that goes through low spots where water pools, and then the cars always get stuck in that point. So just by changing the roads, we can often achieve quite a lot. And that's also then from the economic perspective, where, farmers need to make money, which is clear. And this is not just a nice hobby and nice to have. So we need to see what makes economical sense. And that's why quite often I really like to also then start with roads where we can see, hey, maybe we have a point where we have lots of erosion, and just by slightly changing where the road is, we can slow the erosion so we don't have to fix the road every year, and we can use that road to infiltrate water into the ground. So we're taking something that's causing kind of a monetary pain every year, and we're turning that into an opportunity. So roads are a great way, analysis up front, but yeah, there's just so many points to talk about in analysis. But yeah, I mean, we all have slightly different approaches. So how do you tackle it differently, Oliver?
I wouldn't say I tackle it differently. I mean, you and I work closely together. It would be weird if we had vastly different approaches. But one thing that we haven't mentioned here, which plays a really big role in what is available in your water management strategy, is regulation and the laws around what you are allowed to do. And I love living here in Spain. I'll preface that. And in Europe in general. But this is a very bureaucratic and highly regulated part of the world. And unfortunately, many of the people who are in charge of taking care of our natural resources, water especially, have not caught up with the idea that holding it on landscapes and maybe not draining it as fast down rivers is a good idea. And so there are many things that we have to navigate through, or straight restrictions on what is, best practice for an area. And, this is going to look different everywhere. Sometimes it's a matter of paying a fine. Sometimes it's a matter of striking up a conversation with somebody and co-creating a project, which is really my preferred approach. I've found success with that in almost every project that I've done here on the farm, by making close relationships with the technicians of the local natural park that partly governs the area and the town that I'm in, has actually led to opportunities, including funding support for doing interventions in the river that runs through my farm. So in as much as they can be extremely frustrating, and some people might be telling you that you shouldn't be doing the things that you know are best for your landscape, there are real opportunities, especially as governments and regulatory bodies increasingly catch up to the idea that we are experiencing a water crisis right now, and this is not optional if we want to have a vibrant future ahead. And here in Europe, there are quite a lot of subsidies, grants, and other support mechanisms if you're willing to go through the arduous journey of filling out applications and finding out who the jurisdiction that governs your area is. And so there are as many opportunities, I would say, as there are restrictions and barriers. So I would encourage people to take that on, especially because if you're able to create a positive example of doing this through legal methods, it will open many corridors for other people to do similar things. The inspiration alone serves as an incredible opportunity or new possibilities for people who didn't even know that might be possible. And your experience can help them in the future to navigate the regulatory systems that they will inevitably have to in order to do similar work. Megan, I know you have tons of experience with this, but as we're starting to end our time in the primary portion of this panel, in just a minute, we'll open up for listener questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand digitally in order to start a queue, go ahead and do that. But Megan, can you leave us with some thoughts, some advice on if someone is entirely new to this and is struggling with water management in any different form, what advice would you give them on where to get started so that this doesn't feel so overwhelming?
Yeah, definitely. I would say always start small. You don't need to install a 5-acre pond on your property right away. We can build up to that. You can figure out what the regulation is like in your county. You can figure out if a giant pond even makes sense on your farm, maybe try other methods. And so I would say start small, be curious, and have an open and a growth mindset. And like those 3 things, really incredible things will happen. If you start thinking with a water first mindset, more questions will come and then some answers. But that's just the way the landscape works. And then I did also want to touch on, thank you so much for bringing up the regulation side, because this is really a massive roadblocker for a lot of people in the beginning. And I just wanted to mention that, paradigm shifts usually don't happen legally. And I'm not encouraging everyone to, go out there and do illegal stuff necessarily. But we use this term in the Water Stories core course called pre-legal. And I know I saw Mike made a comment in the chat saying that, the terms you can use sometimes really make a big difference. So, for example, where I am in the Mountain West, fire is a massive issue, which I guess actually where you guys are too. And so if you use the word, if it makes sense with the landscape to install water bodies, if you use the word fire mitigation pond or something along those lines, all of a sudden the bureaucracy be like, oh, for fire? Stamp approval, go ahead. You don't even need to pay anything. And so keeping those pieces in mind when you're starting to get into this kind of work. And then also, I would say last piece of advice is don't jump straight to the, 10-ton excavator installing a pond thing, because that really doesn't make sense in a lot of landscapes. And what matters most is that you are listening to what your land is telling you, and then experimenting, trialing with small plots. So maybe that means, again, a different crop or multi-species, or trying some dry land methods, doing some of those over years, seeing how that goes on your landscape and then trying to implement those solutions. If it makes sense to do large earthworks financially and also with your landscape, by means, go for it. Because like I said, I'm a big advocate for we have diesel. It's cheap. We have big machines. Let's use them for good and not just destruction. So when possible, try that. But otherwise, yeah, just keep an open mindset and keep experimenting, because in the end, the guys who have all the money at the top, they don't know what it is to take risk. They don't know what it's like to be completely reliant on the rains coming or not. And so sometimes you just have to grab the reins yourself and start figuring out what's best for you, your family, and your landscape.
Solid advice, Nick. What would you say for people who are just starting on this journey, how they could get started?
Very, very similar approach. Also on the kind of, I think experimentation is by far the biggest one, starting small and also figuring how that can suit the goals. You know, I mean, all of us, we love ponds. Like if you see a beautiful pond, it just looks cool, it's beautiful, you know, and you have all the wildlife. But as Megan said, like it might not suit your goals. Like depending on the farm you have, maybe you have kind of a shallow well on the farm, or you have a spring that is running a bit lower. And your main goal, like what is your goal? Like, do you want to increase the flow of that spring, or do you want to have more pasture and just more or prolong the growing season? Or maybe for your agroforestry system, have a bit more water there. And then start at what makes sense for that strategy. Because maybe it doesn't make any sense towards your goals to just build a big pond. So first figure out like what you want to go, and then do it in an approach where you're kind of going slowly towards that. And I think the biggest thing, which is also the most difficult for farmers who have machines, is get experience with your hand and a shovel. If you have the tractor or an excavator or a backhoe, you have it there, you know, it's really easy to just whip it out there and just start experimenting with massive earthworks. But you don't really get a feeling for how soil behaves, and especially like the clay, at what level it compacts well, how it works well, how to build a proper spillway and all that. So sometimes with big machines, you can cause quite a lot more damage than good. So I would encourage everyone who's just starting out to just build some really small models and small features with your hands to get a bit of an idea of how it works, and then work your way up from there. And also one thing that we've noticed a lot in the design approach is like, don't try to design something for the whole farm, everything. And I don't know, I've never seen a farmer with lots and lots of budget, but if you have lots and lots of budget, still don't try to implement everything all at once that you've done on your design, but rather like, okay, build one feature in one location that you think might work, build a different type in a different location, and just see which of them performs well, and then getting an idea of like input, output, how much money and effort did you have to put in, and what did you get out in the end. And then every year you do a bit more of the things that work well, and you do less of the things that didn't work. And that way you slowly work through your landscape. And definitely start in the areas that are not so important to you if you don't have a lot of experience. You know, right in front of the house, if you have the prime spot for a perfect water body and you gain your first experience there and you just build a little mud hole, might not be ideal, you know. So choose a site where you can experiment and then slowly get closer to the areas that you care about. Yeah, quite a lot, but yeah, keep it small and experiment.
I love that. There's two real quick things I'll add on to that. One is that, well, first of all, I'm in agreement with everything that you just said, and that in the unfolding of the implementation process, oftentimes it's the connections between elements that make the magic. An element in itself has a limited capacity for accomplishing your goals, but as the ecosystem relationships and connections start to become stronger and build resilience and redundancies, that's when all of these incredible evolutionary expansions start to happen beyond what even you as a designer could anticipate. And I think that's probably a good place to wrap up, at least from the advice side. All three of us are very actively working on making more of this information accessible and helping people to put these ideas in practice on the land. In fact, between the three of us, there are quite a few workshops coming up. From climate farmers, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, we're just wrapping up a working group, both in English and Spanish, to create a guidebook on holistic water management for farmers. And you can expect that to come out pretty soon. So if you are actively farming anywhere in Europe, please consider joining our community for free. You can go to climatefarmers.org and click the link under For Farmers to sign up. And right away, you'll get a chance to interact with others in our network, learn together, and you'll also get free access to those resources when they're available. Megan, can you tell us about some of the work and the opportunities that you have coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. So Nick and I both work for Water Stories as well, and we have a ton of free resources. Please, please, please watch all of our free videos on both YouTube and also on our free community through Mighty Networks. And then in terms of upcoming opportunities, we're going to be in Europe for 2 months, and we have several workshops that we're still currently planning. And so if you sign up for our newsletter, join our community, you'll see updates to all of those opportunities. And the one we're actually just about to announce today is an intensive in Portugal. And I'm so excited. It's for Water Stories students only. It's going to be a deep dive into come onto an active project site. We're going to walk you through all the pieces, all the dynamic decision making that happens while you're installing the earthen body works. So yeah, super excited. We have a lot of really awesome offerings and amazing farms that we're going to be hosting workshops on, and keep you guys up to date on Water Stories, the community, and .com. Yeah.
And Nick, what kind of opportunities, well, some of us we're working on together are coming up this year?
Yeah, so I'll definitely join the Water Stories one that we have coming up. Then we're planning a water workshop together with climate farmers at the end of April in northern Germany. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And then we have some other events around planning wetlands and earthworks and all that, but we don't have the dates and all the details confirmed. But yeah, I would also exactly just iterate, like if you follow climate farmers, you follow Water Stories, or Oliver and me on socials, you will definitely hear about all the learning opportunities that are coming up. And yeah, just, if you just want to learn, we try to post as much as possible for free on social channels. So, if maybe a workshop or a course is not in your budget, you can learn so much for free. So we try to do as much as possible there as well.
Yep. And since all of you guys are following Nick on social media already, I won't plug that too much, but let's open it up now for all of your questions. I'm going through the ones in the chat here. Bettina asked, I'm curious though, where do you see the role of technology? I wonder if tools can make aerial monitoring or vegetation growth modeling help scale these regenerative approaches, asking as a software engineer aspiring to contribute to this movement. Well, I promise you that question was not aimed at me. So maybe Nick, you want to take this one?
Yeah, with pleasure. There's two sides to it. I think the main thing is we should never over rely on technology, because kind of as humans, we have a tendency to just think like, but that can be a bit of a pitfall. And we just need to spend more time in the landscape to just do things while we're on the land and reading with our 5 senses. I think that's the most important to make good decisions. Where I do see the role of technology is in kind of aiding us in that process and also in documentation. And so one technology that I really love there is just drones for mapping. So when we're out there, we have our kind of mental picture of the landscape. We know what it looks like. We know the important points. And then using a drone to just get a really accurate picture of exactly how the topography is, how that looks, especially, if it even has LiDAR, we can get even more data. I think there it's really fantastic to then plan a bit more with that and get a really accurate picture of like how are different points connected in elevation. Because sometimes, the landscape is too big to just do that with a laser level and to see if we could connect these points. But if we have really good data, that allows us to plan a little bit bigger. And on the monitoring side, I think there's tons of really great satellite data available. And so there, you can look at different measures and different ways to see how photosynthesis is happening in the landscape. And that's actually something that we're considering with the team, is to invest into a multispectral drone. So basically a drone that has the cameras to measure photosynthesis. So we could measure the NDVI index of plants. And that would be really interesting, because people always ask, like, okay, but does this water stuff work? And that way, with those type of drones, we could go out, we could do a baseline, we could measure, okay, before we do any work, like this is how much productivity the land is providing in terms of NDVI, so photosynthesis that's happening. And then at certain intervals, so maybe every half a year or every year, we could come back and we could measure, look, in these areas we did something, and this is the impact that it had on those indices that were, on those metrics that we're choosing. And I think that's fantastic, because with the drone, we can relatively quickly do it with high precision on also larger areas. And then, yeah, of course, satellites, the granularity is a bit bigger, but I think they also have a big role to play there to see, is the work happening? Because that's the main thing, especially farmers, like no one is busier than farmers, and no one wants to be out there every day just measuring things. So if we can do the measuring with technology and it's all outcome based, I think that's the main thing, then I definitely see a role for technology there. But yeah, I think Megan, like you and Zach have such a nature touch, full on census approach. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, I just want to echo a lot of the sentiments that you gave, which is that I think there's a lot of potential. However, especially with regards to monitoring, because that's a lot of the not issue, that's not the right word, but yeah, exactly like you said, people are like, wait a second, but does this work? Where are the numbers? Where's the scientific papers? And, people often forget science is based on observation first. So there needs to be something happening that's interesting. And then the scientific papers come. So we're kind of in that stage right now of, hey, look, we have some quantitative or qualitative data showing us like, yeah, this farmer implemented this technology in Rajasthan, India, 35, 40 years ago. And now all of these incredible things have happened. Rivers are flowing again. You have 250 wells that have water again, et cetera, et cetera. But they didn't do a lot of great documentation in the beginning. And now people are like, wait, what do you mean? It hasn't always just been this way? And like, no, it's changed that way because of human land usage. So I would say technology in regards to the monitoring piece to make it as easy as possible for farmers and landowners to document the before the project change, and then also after the implementation stage, and moving forward, because the whole point, at least in my mind, is regeneration, where you can kind of just leave it and it continues to get better and better in terms of more photosynthesis, more cooling effect, more biodiversity, et cetera. So if we can use technology to improve our monitoring so that's super easy for farmers, love that. What I would love to avoid, that I think is one of the massive issues we have today, is we as humans have kind of forgot what it is to be humans. And we can, this is a whole nother talk, but that's all just to say that, people look at technology as like the saving grace. But I think we need to remember that technology is a tool, and it's not something that, yes, it can make our lives easier, but we can't forget how to read the landscape. We can't forget how to survive when the electricity goes out. And so I would say with the technologies that we create today, especially in regards to regenerative farming, just keeping in mind that it's a tool, not a reliance piece.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll add to that is we have never had access to more data and measurement tools and technology than we do right now. And it does not seem to have positively affect our interactions with the landscape. And so I am very skeptical that more technology is the way out of this. It can definitely play a role in assisting, but until we come to a cultural and mindset shift that informs the way that we interact with the living world, the technology as a tool can be just as easily and more likely misused than appropriately applied. So we'll leave that one there. The next question that we've got up from the chat is from Ekaterina, who asks, does anyone know of a plan for how Spain could turn around and combat desertification and land degradation as a country? Sort of a plan of what could be done in each region based on regional context, laid out as a report, implementation plan, or a playbook of solutions for Spain specifically with regional context. I'll quickly start that off and then hand over to you guys, but yeah, multiple of these have been made. Specifically, the one that I like to refer to is the one created by the Mian Institute out of the University of Valencia, where he did most of this study and has worked as a meteorologist. Anyway, the point being, he's done extensive studies about the land use and management changes of the Iberian Peninsula, specifically his area of Valencia, over the last couple of millennia, and how it has affected climatic patterns in that period of time. There is an entire list of recommendations, and I mean, this has been submitted, I think, even at the EU and UN level. And though these plans exist, they are not being put into implementation. They are struggling to get funding. I don't know that making more of these plans is what we lack. And quite frankly, some of them very quickly are probably going to become outdated, even though the broad patterns and some of the recommendations I'm sure still apply. But until we get the people who have the power to make them happen, we start to shift our resources and our focus to actually supporting these plans. It's not a matter of research. It's not a matter of modeling. It's a matter of the disconnect between resources and opening up the gates to be able to do this work. And quite frankly, I personally am convinced that this is going to happen at a small community level before it's going to happen at a large national or international level. Nick, Megan, do you guys have any insights on this?
Yeah, definitely. So for me, the big one there is kind of when do we want this work to start? Because I see a big danger in like over planning, and it just takes kind of forever to make the plan. And then when you have the plan, it needs to be funded, and then you need to find the funding. And by the point you find the funding, maybe government has been elected in a new way, new priority, and then everything, the context changes, because things are happening quickly, and then you can start over again. And so on that side, I'm not the biggest fan of, similar to Oliver, of making these massive plans and then seeing, but rather, and I think we can get more work done by focusing on real results on the ground and creating examples. So basically just saying like, hey, let's find the individual landowners that are already motivated, that have some budget to do this and that are motivated. And then we start building lots and lots of these example places, because in this whole regenerative movement, nothing works better than seeing examples. Like no one reads a white paper and is like, oh, this is exciting, I'm going to dedicate my life to this. But you go to a place that used to be a desert and is now a green paradise, and you're like, wow, this is possible. I want more of this. So we need to create more of these examples on the ground. And that's, I think, also really important for on the government level, because there's so much risk involved. If you're involved in policy on the government level, and you have to decide these things, and there's just some papers that say this might work or all that, but you've never seen the example. Like, how could you be super motivated to really get behind this? And if we can show, like, look, this is tons of different examples just in Spain that worked, and these are for different regions, let's do more of that, I think we will get a lot more done. And especially neighbors, if you have 10 neighboring farms and one of them is suddenly green and the others are struggling and desertifying, they're going to start asking what was done differently on that green farm. And so I think if we just create enough examples in different areas and show that it can also work economically, and it's not just, for rich people to play with, but actually there's like an economic model behind it that makes sense. Yeah, I feel like we will get more done than over planning and hoping that we do all of Spain at once. How do you see that, Megan?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and just one quick little note on what you just said. I mean, that's how conventional farming came to be, right? Is that, everyone was like, oh, wow, that made my life a lot easier. Look at how fast that harvest was. So we just have to, keep that in mind. We are human in the end. And then also you guys did a fantastic job. I don't have much else to say. Echo a lot of the same sentiments, but I did want to point out a group in Slovakia called the Water Holistic, and they're doing absolutely phenomenal work. If you're looking for examples of people who have been doing this thing for 30, 40 years, these are the guys. The Water Holistic, they came out. It's a group of policymakers, practitioners, scientists, and they have really incredible scientific papers to look at, and also on the ground, hundreds of thousands of implementations all across Slovakia. So check them out. And we're also making a film through Water Stories on what they're doing in their work. So keep that in the back of your minds. Probably won't be for like a year or so, but yeah, they're an incredible group, and there's lots of examples out there. So I would just say, look to what people are doing now. And I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with coming up with these big regional plans, for sure. But in the end, it's like what Nick and Oliver said, where we have to have on the ground examples where people are seeing what's possible, because that's the first thing politicians are going to ask is like, okay, will this work? And so you need places to point to. And there's a lot out there already.
Amazing. Juan Pablo, go for it, buddy. Good to see you here.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to see the discussion and to hear from you guys. I haven't seen you in a while. I posted my question on the chat box, but essentially I'm working with species selection and composition, and I'm just wondering whether for the role of for water infiltration, if that's kind of like the main objective, if that's preferred than water retention on the perspective of doing earthworks versus planting the right species. Is there a preference for that? Because I mean, as in earthworks would hydrate the landscape and it would provide a spontaneous species, but maybe there are some other species that can provide that infiltration capacity a lot faster than just kind of like waiting for the rewilding component, let's say. So yeah, I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that answer. Thanks for the question.
My pleasure.
Yeah, again, it goes back to depends on your goals. So if your personal goal on your farm is to infiltrate water as fast as possible, then planting, like focusing on soil health and creating as much of a soil sponge as you possibly can is absolutely one of the greatest things you can do. Where water bodies become beneficial is when you have really, because like we talked at the beginning of this talk about how now we don't have lots of little rainstorms. We have big storms and they come all at once, and then there's a long period. Those really become a benefit when you have that situation of a lot of rain all at once, because I look at it like a shock absorber for the system. So it shock absorbs, okay, it folds a bunch of that rain, and then now we have 2 months of no rain. And so slowly that water is going to start infiltrating into the ground, or quickly if you have sandy soils, that rate really depends. And alternatively, sometimes a farm would want to have water bodies that hold water on the landscape so they can use that for irrigation. So we've been contacted a lot by vineyards, especially who really want a lot of different water bodies all throughout the landscape, so that not only is it hydrating the soil as the water meanders down the slight hill that this vineyard is on, but at the same time, they can use that water, extend the amount of irrigation they have into the dry season a little bit further. So yeah, I would say 100% look into plants, look into building soil health. It's coupled. It's not one or the other, it's both. So I'm curious what you have to say, Nick and Oliver, about his question about plants.
No, I really like the example that you gave there, and absolutely doing proper research on the appropriate species is important. And almost as important is the relationship between those species, and there's no one that will do all the work for you. So going back to what I said earlier about polycultures, it's oftentimes the magic that happens when there are diverse and robust relationships both above and below ground. There are many examples of how beneficial properly managed grazing can be, and kickstarting and facilitating the cycles of regrowth, exudates, root sloughing, and all of these other things that interact and complete cycles. There's no functional ecosystem anywhere in the world that doesn't have animal impact. I'm not just talking about cattle and sheep and goats, but all of the wildlife that has a unique relationship and beneficial, synergy with the plant and fungal and microbial populations. They all work together. At any time, there is a major category or sometimes even a specific species that is absent from an ecosystem. You either need to go in and try and do that job that is missing. We will never do it as well as those who do it as part of their life function. And so trying to incorporate as many forms and diversities of life into a space is crucial for reaching the potential, not only through water, but also through the cycles of minerals, of water, energy flows, and those other elements that create a complete ecosystem. Nick, what do you have to say for that?
Just one little thing to add is really looking at brittleness as well. So if we have an environment that's really brittle, where it means that basically we have water at some point of the year and then really long dry spell and then a little bit of water again, whereas a non-brittle environment where you have moisture kind of evenly spread throughout the year. In the non-brittle environments, quite often, you just plant your trees or shrubs or whatever you're planting, and there's a good chance that they will grow. On the more brittle side, I've seen so many projects where just a lot of effort was put into planting, but then there wasn't enough water available and all these plants died. Or sometimes, it was try to keep them alive with irrigation. And so the irrigation kind of kept them barely alive. And then at some point, if there's any issue with the irrigation system, then they still die. And there I've seen a really big kind of advantage of doing some kind of earthworks or improving the landscape for water management, because if the water is there and the water just does its work passively, you almost don't need to plant the trees because they kind of plant themselves if the moisture is available. And so sometimes by really doing a proper job on the water side, the ecosystem side, so the tree and shrub side, your life will be much, much easier. But yeah, as also Megan and Oliver said, it really depends on what are you trying to achieve on that land and what's the main goal.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Juan Pablo. And let's go to Kieran. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, Megan. Hi, Nick. Good to see you again. Hi, Oliver. I still haven't really made much progress in my own personal professional project, but anyway, that's another story. But I've been very interested in flooding lately. I've just been really looking into when we were in Italy on the workshop, there was a big flood in it's called a river called the Gier, and it's an affluent of the Rhone, and not as severe as Valence, but pretty heavy, all the same. And it really was probably, I think, the first time we got kind of one of these events that you could say, yeah, this is where the rain is getting concentrated out of the summer. It's a normal dry summer in France, but then it's as you say, when it hits harder, as you were saying earlier on. And Megan, for instance, you were saying about measuring before and after effects. Somebody was coming along a few years later and saying, well, it was always like this. I'm just wondering, from the work that you did when you went to meet the water holistic people, that had they gotten measurements to say, well, this has improved the situation for flash flooding, for instance? Is there any data out there that you can say, yeah, this type of approach will help with flash flooding? That's it, really. That's the question for all of you. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, totally. Thanks so much, Kieran. It's a great question. Yeah, because we haven't spoken too much about flooding and how this work also helps mitigate floods. So I would say, to answer your question first about water holistic, yes, they have incredible examples. I saw a check dam that was, I think, 25 years old and still functioning, built out of wood, which is amazing. And also there's this gully in Tiki Potok, which is a town in the east side of Slovakia. And there's an incredible story there that, again, I can't wait to share with you guys via the video we create. But basically, they were going to build a giant reservoir there. It ended up not happening. And instead, they were able to get government funding for installing lots of check dams, beaver dam analogs, that kind of same concept where there was lots of big erosion gullies, because this is quite a mountainous region or hilly region. And so big erosion gullies, nothing was able to grow because every time it did rain, it came with a flood. And then it would erode those gullies even further and further and further. And so what they did was they came in and they installed this low tech, just with trees, branches, rocks, whatever material they had around, lots and lots of little step check dams all throughout these erosion gullies, all across this watershed. And now, visiting there 30 years later, you can't even tell that there was work done there. It just looks like this natural stepped wetland. And when it rains, it's able to slowly meander down the hillside instead of all rushing once down the erosion gully. So I would say that, yes, there's absolutely physical examples. I'm not 100% sure if they have data that would be like scientifically accepted necessarily. They might, I'm just not sure personally. But yeah, they have really amazing examples there. And let's see, what else do I want to say? I just keep thinking of example after example of different terraces that I've seen in Italy and in Ecuador and Peru that have helped mitigate any kind of flooding events that happen. And so, yeah. And then the other piece, that's what I wanted to say. So the other piece is a lot of times when people talk about flooding, they talk about flooding of human infrastructure that was built in floodplains. So we have to take on the responsibility as the human race who lives in these places where we've built in floodplains and say, oh, maybe we shouldn't have built that town there, or maybe we, and so I would say that flooding, yes, we can use these methods to mitigate it. However, you have to make sure that it makes sense and that the town or the barn or whatever is built in the correct place, because the 100-year flood events are going to become more and more common. So we should anticipate this, and we should say, hey, look, it's better now that we take the barn apart and put it more uphill than to, experience the destruction of that infrastructure. So I'm curious, Nick, what you have to say about flooding.
Yeah, 100%. What you said, the one thing I would add is trying to go as high up as possible in the water catchment. Because when we speak about flooding, we often look at kind of the final destination, so to say, of the water just before the coast. And those cities are often the ones that get hit the hardest, as we've seen in Spain, also in recent months. And there, I think it's also really important where farmers come in. It's like many of the farms, they have some higher parts of water catchments. And so if those areas could already infiltrate and store that water compared to it just running on the surface and washing further down, all that water that's in the ground and that's recharging aquifers is not causing flooding further down. And also, as was written in the chat, like you don't need to do this necessarily with water bodies or any earthen structures. If you have a good pasture and you have your animal herd that leads to infiltration, or a really nice diverse cover crop mix with direct seeding so that all that water can infiltrate. Like every drop that's in the ground and recharging the aquifer is a drop less that can cause destruction. So I think that's the biggest one. Like we need to start looking at flood mitigation at the top of the mountain and water catchment, and not just trying to build bigger walls in the cities.
Yeah,
if you wouldn't mind, Oliver, I have one more point to that before, which is, yes, look up higher. However, again, context, look into your region. So Italy, especially northern Italy experiences tons of landslides. And so maybe in those contexts, say you have a farm that's at the top of a hill in northern Italy, maybe infiltration shouldn't be your goal necessarily, at least in the terms we're talking about right now, because it could cause landslides. So look into the historical context of where you are. And that's where these techniques are so incredible and so diverse. And it's hard to speak about them as, like singular solutions, but it's more of a mindset of, okay, what's your place? And then how can I reshape the land to allow for the most beneficial outcome for the water, for the humans, and the other living beings that live there? Okay, go for it, Oliver.
No, that's a super important thing that you mentioned there. And quite frankly, I wish we had more time to go into safety considerations for all the things that we just talked about. Quite frankly, they are far too overlooked when discussing especially earthworks. And we could have an entire discussion just on the atrocious things that we have seen on other landscapes that cause real problems and are entirely avoidable. Part of that will be covered in the guidebook that we're going to be putting out soon, so that you can at least consider where you are in a catchment, some basic calculations to make sure that your features are safe. So please take some time to do that. And I think one of the conclusions that we can come to here to wrap up this session is that there is enormous potential in what you can do on your own land base, but there is far bigger potential in working with water at a community level. Water is not a resource that respects boundaries. And I know of not even the wealthiest people around the world who have enough land to cover entire watersheds. And quite frankly, there are appropriate and necessary bits of work to be done at every single level of a water catchment, assuming that you treat it as such. And so if anybody here is listening and does not have access to land, please don't think that this is not for you. There are endless things that you can do, whether it's helping to change policy around water management, helping the people who are struggling to get this work done on their own land. Every single part of this work requires support right now. We're not even trying to get positive things done. We're still in the stage of trying to reduce the amount of horribly destructive things that are common. So there is work for everybody here. I really hope that some of what we talked about can serve as inspiration and a little bit of guidance for you in your own journey. And if you have any more questions, there are endless ways to reach out to us and the wider community that is doing this work. So please, hopefully this will serve as a call to action. We need everybody's hands on deck for this one. And thank you so much for coming and participating in this panel with us today. There will be quite a few more coming out every single month of this year through the Climate Farmers series. The next one will be around agroforestry and the beneficial presence of trees in all types of farm enterprises. So keep an eye out for those and have a good rest of your night. Thank you all so much for coming.
Now, before we wrap this up, just remember that these episodes are only the beginning of the learning resources, design and coaching services, in-person courses, and interactive community that are available through Regenerative Skills. The Discord server is our free community where you can connect with other like-minded listeners, exchange ideas, stories, tips, and resources, as well as interact with me directly and quite a few former guests from this show. Our Instagram account @regen_skills is the best place to see the projects that me and the team are working on, both for clients and collaborators, as well as on our own properties. I'll also be announcing the certification courses, workshops, and gatherings that we've got coming up later this year. If you're interested in getting dedicated support for your own project, you can now schedule a free planning session with one of our team members through the request form on our website. You can also find all the links, show notes, and past resources there at regenerativeskills.com. We truly believe that no matter your experience, your knowledge, abilities, resources, or background, you can be a powerful force for regeneration on this planet, and we're here to help you find your path. So as always, remember to keep taking those little steps every day towards a regenerative future, and I'll be right by your side along the way.